Hello, welcome to Module 7, Chapter 14 lecture. This is not going to be a very long lecture. There's some important information in Chapter 14, but I'm also not going to test you on that much of it. We're looking at labor relations, basically union labor relations with employees versus employer and how to deal with the unions. The book talks a little bit about some employee benefits. It's not that important for you. Construction worker sort of defines things, 14.2 employment in the construction industry. I mean, a lot of people are employed in the trades. There are a lot of unions involved, more particularly when you get in the more urban areas. But you can sort of skim through those type things. The role of the unions, 14.5 and union history. Again, they're not that important here for this class. It's not going to hurt you to sort of skim through a little bit of it. We've covered some of the history in the chapter 13 lecture. One thing to note, though, is the information in 14.8 and 14.9 with regards to the local union. Every union, they have, they'll have a national or international union, as a corporate type structure. They'll have bylaws, they'll have a constitution they need to follow. And then ultimately you get to the local union, and the local union tends to be autonomous. They tend to be on their own as far as how things are implemented. And this goes because things that are very regional, dealing with construction, things that are, transient type employees coming through looking for work, you have to sort of adapt to the area that you're working in and where your project is, and adapt also sometimes to state specific laws that might affect some of the work you're trying to do. So keep in mind that local unions are on their own. They might have some national guidelines to follow, but they're on their own as far as implementing them and how they rule themselves. Book talks a little bit about union work rules. I mean, you can sort of glance over that and take a look at it. I'm not going to test anything on that. The one thing that I do want you to understand, though, is about collective bargaining. There's going to be some questions on collective bargaining for sure. And it is the root to what unions are in place for. They bargain the contracts that their employees or their union members are going to work under. So it's pretty important to understand that. And the collective bargaining agreements that go and are put in place are binding on everybody. You hear about it in sports in particular when somebody goes on strike, you hear about it there. The collective bargaining agreements and when they're set to expire and when they get renewed and the effect it might have on an industry. So it's pretty important that you pick up on the purposes behind it. The book talks about in 14.12 there that the law does not actually define what is meant by good faith bargaining, although the NLRB does, they deal with the courts. They've indicated some things about good faith bargaining. There's definitely some obvious situations where you don't have good faith, but there's a gray area sometimes what that is good faith bargaining. But that's the main point of what you need to have in your bargaining agreement is both sides come to the table, ready to share and work out a deal. Patterns for bargaining, things like that, withdrawal from a bargaining unit. There are things that you can sort of skim over. They're not going to be tested on, that's for sure. Sometimes you get these labor agreements. I'm in 14.16. You get these settlements between the contractors and the labor union maybe pinned down and helped to facilitate by the NLRB. And then, once these agreements are in place, they're signed by the parties, they're referred to as the collective bargaining agreement. This is what everybody wants to follow in 1416. So you kind of got to know a little bit from here. Bargaining agreements in the construction industry have plenty of provisions that cover a big range of topics, but most of it is negotiated, and they tend to be things like wages, hours worked, fringe benefits, overtime, holiday pay, different types of working conditions, and trying to, maybe take breaks, that type thing. The chuck wagons are always on construction sites, in the middle of the day or more in the middle of the morning, because they know when people get their 15-minute break or their 30-minute break in the morning, that type of thing. So that's the kind of stuff that's covered in a labor agreement. It can also be, some retirement packages. A lot of things can actually go in them, and it's going to vary between the union and the contractor. So while you might have a labor agreement between, let's say, a local electrical union with contractors, you're going to also have something completely different with Major League Baseball and the owners. So it's going to vary between the industries. Sometimes you have actual project agreements. Union labor agreements are called project agreements. They've become more commonplace in recent years. Project agreement is a labor contract that normally applies only to a specific construction project, and it's usually something very large. So let's say, DC was going to build a new metro station. It's going to take up a city block, and it's going to be underground, and a huge undertaking. I knew people that worked on the convention center in DC. I mean, it's like a whole block of city block taken up. So those type things are huge jobs, and they tend to have a project agreement where things are specific to that project, and the project's going to last a few years. And so that's kind of interesting to know. Let's see, what else am I looking for here? The national agreements are something that you're going to need to know. I'm pretty sure there's some questions on it in the exam. Just realize that they're applicable. They're labor contracts are negotiated between like AFL-CIO, International Building Trade Unions, certain individual contractors. It just tells you these things are global in nature. Usually the national agreement does not include any terms or provisions of local labor contracts, but does provide that all workers must be obtained through local union hiring halls. They also usually contain no strike and no lockout clauses. That's a big deal for the national agreements. When you enter into these things, it's like, okay, you can't strike. That's the employee side of it. That's what they get to do, and then the owners are like, you can't lock this. The owners can't lock out the employee. So everybody has to stick to the agreement, and you breach the agreement if you strike, or you breach the agreement if you lock your employees out. So that's the significance of a national agreement. And then, the book talks a little bit about employer lockouts. I think you probably understand what that is. You've seen enough of it on television, news. You certainly know what strikes are. I'm not going to ask anything about administration of the labor contract or damage suits, because a damage suit is pretty much understandable. You breach it, there's damages that will occur, and you will get sued for it. Let's see. One of the things too that you can look at. I don't know that we have too much merit shop contractors around here, but just sources of open shop labor. You can read that. It is interesting. Closed shops and open shops. And so, an open shop, open shop contractors are obtaining adequate numbers of skilled workers. Of necessity, the open shop firm must recruit its workforce through more informal channels than does the unionized counterpart, which is the closed shop. So open shop is literally open to anybody. Closed is a union shop only type situations. And there are reasons sometimes to go outside the union to hire better workers. There are definitely times when that happens. Let's see. Unions usually have an apprenticeship program. I'm not going to ask anything about that, but for your own purposes, if you're looking for something, that is definitely an approach you can take, is to try to get into a union that has an apprenticeship program. 1432 is interesting. It talks about dual shop operation, and NLRB has approved this. They have dual shops, or double-breasted is the term that is utilized in the end of the first paragraph there under 14.32, and that contractors can have a whole setup. One of them is an open shop operation, and then some parts of it can be closed. This is a dual operation or dual shop operation, where and it behooves the general contractor to be able to do this. Usually, hiring local or hiring union workers comes with a little bit different pay and a little bit different rules that a lot of times employers sometimes need more flexibility, especially if it's not a large job, and need to be able to move people around, and therefore an open shop side of operations could be more beneficial to them. That's going to wrap up 14. So there's a few things in there, like we discussed already, that you need to hit the highlights on. It's a short chapter. 15 is going to be also very similar and quite short, and we're going to focus primarily on OSHA. But for 14, I've given you what you need to know for the test. Take a look at those sections. I don't think you'll find anything here too difficult. Thank you, and I'll be right back with chapter 15.